Okay, thank you all for coming this morning. As you may know, this year marks the 40th anniversary of the start of the National Reconnaissance Office. So we felt it was a good time to take a look at a little history of the NRO. And to help us with that today is Mr. Cargill Hall, who's the NRO historian. Mr. Hall, please.
Thank you, Mike. And welcome to NRO History 101, I guess you might say. My assistant will be operating the PowerPoint, and for your edification, will cause spacecraft to appear and move about in outer space. Today, I'll be covering 4 points: the origins of the NRO, why are we celebrating the 40th anniversary when the NRO as a named organization appeared in 1961, agents of change in the NRO's evolution. We'll review the satellite systems, and finally consider some of the technical highlights that have marked the evolution of the NRP, the National Reconnaissance Program, and the NRO. Well, let's consider the origins. America, and I'm going to spend a few moments on this because I think it really is important to understand, especially for younger people. At the end of World War II, the United States, among the major powers, was essentially unaffected in terms of bomb damage and that sort of thing. It possessed the atomic bomb, and it really was the solitary power at that time. 10 years later, in 1955, American children were practicing duck and cover. People were nervous. Times had changed dramatically. And what transpired, of course, was the rise of communism. After the war, the eastern satellite states were taken. In 1949, the Soviet Union exploded an atomic device, well ahead of people's expectations. China fell to the communist forces of Mao Zedong in 1949, and in 1950, there was a surprise attack against South Korea that really caught everyone off guard and created enormous concern that that was a precursor of a war to follow in Europe in the beginning of the Third World War. And December 1950, in particular, I would rank as an equivalent moment in time like the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's not as well known, but that was right after the Chinese Communist forces entered North Korea, and President Truman did a number of things, and among them he authorized the first overflights of denied territory in peacetime and inaugurated the beginning of peacetime strategic reconnaissance. And the concern then, as it was through say the next 10 years roughly, was a concern for atomic surprise attack. All of these people had been leaders in World War II, and all of them had Pearl Harbor seared into their psyches in ways that it's hard for us today to understand. But President Eisenhower, who succeeded Truman in 1953, determined it wouldn't occur on his watch, and he is the one who made the policy for peacetime strategic reconnaissance. That's the overflight of denied territory outside of war, a national policy, and he authorized all of the overhead systems to do it that we have today in various variants. The first, the U-2 soldiers on, the SR-71, which he also authorized, A-12/SR-71 in '59, of course, is no longer in the inventory, and all of the early satellite programs, the Navy SIGINT satellite program, GRAB, in 1959. The year before that, he authorized the Corona satellite program in 1958, which was drawn from an Air Force reconnaissance satellite program that then underway. So by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1950s, there were 3 satellite programs, 2 of them covert, with the Air Force program operating essentially in the open. Our access to information on the Soviet Union provided by the U-2 ended abruptly, 1st of May 1960, when the U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down deep inside Russia. This rang a curtain down. The issue at that moment was we'd already resolved the bomber gap. There wasn't any. But the missile gap at that time really was fueling American political debate. Eisenhower was satisfied that there was not a missile gap based on what the U-2 had not seen. But of course, it had only covered a small portion of the Soviet Union, but those portions that we were most concerned of, and as a matter of fact, Powers' flight was directed to overfly Plesetsk, which was known to be a building at that time, which was a missile base. In its aftermath, in the 1960s, and here we move to the agents of change, the forces and conditions that have shaped the NRO in its history, Eisenhower ordered an evaluation of the Air Force satellite program, which was the only one not under civilian control. And by this time, he judged satellites and reconnaissance vehicles of any kind, satellites, aircraft, to be national assets. And he did not think they should be under the control of any single military service. As a former Supreme Allied Commander of the European theater in World War II, he knew the military, and he was not interested in having information presented that was favorably disposed to one side or another. He wanted a civilian entity in charge of it. 4 months after the U-2 was shot down in August 1960, the first Corona success occurred. The curtain was lifted. Let's look at that. In fact, you can see the very day that Powers was in the dock and sentenced to 10 years, the capsule came back. And at that time, the Discoverer Project was something that was represented as a biomedical research program. But this is the recovery sequence. You've seen the launch and ascent sequence. And incidentally, the film retrieved on that one mission was greater in amount than all of the pictures taken on the U-2 flights. There were 24 of those over the years. That same day, well, not that same day, but a week later, on the 25th of August, 1960, the President and the National Security Council considered plans for what was then the SAMOS project, which was the Air Force reconnaissance satellite, and determined to remove it from Air Force control and put it in a civilian office in the Department of Defense. And the person chosen to head up this new civilian office, which was called Office of Missile and Satellite Systems, MSS, was Joseph Cherick, who was the Undersecretary of the Air Force. And the Air Force officer in charge of the reconnaissance satellite program, SAMOS, on the West Coast then reported directly to Cherick, and Cherick reported not to the Air Force, but to the Secretary of Defense. This did not please Air Force leaders, needless to say, because at that time, reconnaissance satellites was about 90% of the military space program. So they were left then with communication satellites and what was MIDAS, the early warning, and navigation, which the Navy controlled at that time. And so it was quite a blow for the Air Force. Now it happened in the transition in January when the Kennedy administration appeared that the new Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had known Cherick at the Ford Motor Company, and he asked him to stay on in the new administration once he'd been briefed and learned about Corona, SAMOS, and the others. And by this time, plans for Gambit, the follow-on, were underway in the Air Force Project Office on the West Coast. And they discussed this, and McNamara who incidentally will be attending or visiting the NRO in May, early May, to receive an award from Mr. Hall, decided that summer to pull together all of the covert and overt reconnaissance projects into one place, and he established the National Reconnaissance Program and the NRO on 6 September of '61. And into that, he then took the Air Force office that Cherrick led, since it was a civilian office. It was a DOD operation, however, and he moved Corona in there. It took another, there was an agreement with the CIA to do this, and Bissell, Richard Bissell, who was in charge of Corona, and Cherrick, who was in charge of Samos, were co-directors of the NRO for the first year or so. But Bissell almost immediately, within a few months, resigned, leaving Cherrick in charge. So another agreement was struck in '62. And in that agreement, Cherrick was named the sole director, and the Navy program, the GRAB, and by then Poppy, moved into the NRO. And a lot of people in the CIA weren't too happy because they didn't have a direct leading role. So in 1963, a third program was established, or a third agreement was established, and that made the deputy director at the NRO a CIA billet, and that's continued from that day to this. The last of our charters, and there was a lot of pushing and pulling during this period, especially between these programs, which by this time were identified as Program A was the Air Force satellite programs, Program B, the CIA programs, and Program C, the Navy programs. Well, finally, in the last agreement, and the current one under which we operate today, in 1965, the DOD and the CIA struck an agreement that allowed disagreements, I would say disputes, to be settled by an executive committee composed of the Undersecretary of Defense, the DCI, and the President's Science Advisor. So you had the DOD, the CIA, and the White House directly involved. If a new program was to begin, they would make the decision and they would assign it to whichever the programs they thought best qualified to do that. In this pioneering era, technology remained at a premium. New technology was coming along all the time. We went from, in the imaging, for example, from those small, compact, high acuity panoramic cameras with the rotating lenses that Corona used, to the final design of the counter-rotating optical bar panoramic camera, which is sort of the end of that development in the hexagon program. And throughout this time, the uses of this intelligence remained pointed on the strategic side. That is to say, we were concerned about surprise attack, indications and warning, where the forces, the military strategic forces were located, how many of them, and the like. And so this information was being provided essentially to the national command authorities. There's a picture on the screen of one of Corona's early views of a Soviet missile base. Well, by the 1970s, things began to change. The SIGINT satellites, low-altitude SIGINT satellites that the Navy operated in the sea and the Air Force, and that began, and the tactical exploitation of national capabilities as it's known today, which now includes both imaging and SIGINT, also began in a very rudimentary fashion in the 1970s. In the meantime, institutionally, the President Ford in this case, abolished the XCOM, which was in charge of making decisions on the NRO, and he put the DCI essentially in charge of the the budget for the NRP, because the DCI, after all, was supposed to be the leader for all the intelligence community. But by doing so, and at the same time, I might add, President Nixon, just months previously, had eliminated the science advisor at the White House. So our link there disappeared. So the Undersecretary of Defense, who used to chair this, ceased to attend the XCOM at all, and the DCI that now worked this dealt primarily with what is today the C-cubed-I, Assistant Secretary of Defense. They could decide things, but now it was a recommendation. And you had to have staff work done. And so decisions started taking longer to implement. And at the same time, Congress in the mid-70s looked at the Intelligence Committee with investigations, the Church and the Pike committees, as you'll recall, and came on, established new committees, the HIPSI and the SISI, so that where in the beginning we dealt with 2 committees in Congress and only with the chairman and the ranking minority person and maybe 1 staffer, because it was exceedingly closely held information. Suddenly now we had more committees to deal with. Today there's 6, and you had lots of staffs involved. And Stansfield Turner was, was the one who perhaps most closely held control of the whole NFIT budget. By now, there is a recognized need for SIGINT and ELINT dissemination systems. The classification is a problem. We're stovepiped. We can't release Byman material to the outside world. But in 1981, we did the Joint Chiefs of Staff to move information to the warfighters and improve it. They did create the Defense Reconnaissance Support Program, and that position, a 1-star billet, served both on the JCS and at the NRO. First, the Gulf War in January and February. And while a lot of information that we had could get in theater, not all of it, especially the imagery, could go much beyond command headquarters at CENTCOM. And as a result, people began to look at an architecture that had been structured to provide information for national command authorities, the strategic reconnaissance. And within a year, OSO was created. Oh, thank you. And events began to really change, and emphasis and focus began to move much more towards support of the warfighter, with a corresponding decrease, because you got fixed assets, a fixed number, decrease in the strategic reconnaissance. In the 1990s, the NRO was announced publicly in 92. In 96, we moved into this facility, which of course caught some congressional attention, and at about the same time, we had the famous forward funding situation that turned out to be a real embarrassment, and it jeopardized our reputation with Congress, and I'm sure with the public as well, because what had happened was had provided the funds to the different programs in years before, and they had obligated the funds and rolled them over to another fiscal year, which you can do, but they hadn't told the folks in the Pentagon suite, which was then headquarters, how much there were, and nobody was quite sure. And so the director at the time would tell Congress, well, there's 300 million, and a week later it was $1 billion, and it ended up to be over $3 billion, and the committees took a lot of that money away. Some of it was quite justified. For example, an Atlas pad modification had been postponed and that kind of thing. And boosters had, but that didn't matter. So by this time, the programs or the oversight in Congress really was becoming almost adversarial. As Mr. Hall will say, you'd appear before them and say, well, how much money are you going to give up, rather than what do you need to operate. So it was a chaotic period there for a time. I would say he's been very effective in overcoming this. And I would also say that this year perhaps marks a turning point in terms of that kind of confrontational activity. I think we're supported a little better at this point. NEMA was created in November of '95. Meantime, tactical support for military and national missions were clearly ascended, and we clearly had new customers to serve. This was the end of the film recovery systems and film systems. It was probably the most complex vehicle ever to operate in space. The counter-rotating optical bars, I've forgotten the speed of the film going through these things, and that had to be changed over the time on the rollers and still reach these buckets at a given tension without brakes. It's just a remarkable instrument. And it was both panoramic, so it was a combination almost of search and surveillance. I think its best resolution was around 2 feet, so it was a remarkable machine. And but they were able to align the axis perpendicular to the Earth, and they could take pictures every time the little machine rotated. And the Weather Service took one look at that and said, that's what we want for our low-altitude weather satellite. So they went to NASA and told Mr. Webb that they weren't interested in his stuff with all the bells and whistles. And from that time to this, the two weather satellites have used the same bus. It used to be RCA generated. I don't know who owns it now, with slightly different instruments. And recently, the NRO component, which was known as DMSP, the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program, it has been combined with the civil system, and it's now called NOESS, and don't ask me to define that term at the moment. But it's a fascinating kind of sidebar to this whole thing. And that you might have regarding the NRO and its life. Yes?
You had a bullet on an earlier chart about commercial competition with the NRO, and I don't think you commented on it. Did you have some words that you wanted to say about that?
Well, a commercial, I don't recall a particular bullet, although I wasn't following this absolutely closely. In imagery, of course, which is really the only commercial competition that we're looking at right now, and probably the only, it's not really competition to my view, and I don't think Mr. Hall views it that way either, because it really allows the NRO with finite assets to address other things, and the NEMA literally will buy a very large chunk of imagery from them. The difficulty, if you talk to the policy shop, is that we don't have a firm policy on it, so yes, sir.
You mentioned the three initial reconnaissance space programs, Corona and Grab, and then there was a third one?
Samos was the third one.
What was Samos's mission?
Okay, that's a good point. I glossed over that rather quickly. The RAND Corporation had come up with an idea for a reconnaissance satellite for the Air Force. And in 1954-55, they adopted it, and the production of ballistic missiles made it possible. Before that time, to launch a reconnaissance satellite meant you had to create a launch vehicle. And then you were looking at astronomical sums, and everybody said, well, we can't justify that. But with the ballistic missile program, suddenly all things became possible. And there was a competition. The Air Force held a competition, which was won by Lockheed. RCA had, I've been told, had really a better proposal using a television satellite, which incidentally then was sold to the Army and became Tyros. But Lockheed won it, and that's where the Agena satellite came from, because that was the upper stage to launch it. And their payloads consisted of an imaging payload that would read out. It was near real-time readout, but it was developing a biomat film on board, scanning it electronically, and then radioing the images to Earth. Well, difficulty with this at that time was these low-altitude satellites would pass over the ground stations, which had to be in the US because nothing was encrypted. You had a 10-minute look, and you couldn't get enough, didn't have enough bandwidth. So the Air Force came up with a film recovery idea, which Eisenhower stripped away and then made into Corona and gave to an Air Force CIA team, or CIA led it, and the Air Force supplied the infrastructure and launched them and all the rest. The SAMOS also, well, it was known as 117L, Weapon System 117L, also had other components. It had an early warning infrared satellite that Lockheed had come up with, which today is the Defense Support Program / SIBRS. And there were some other elements. It was kind of an umbrella. And so when the near-time readout was canceled in the early 60s, Corona and its follow-ons took over. Now, a lot of people say, film readout gambit, using the basic thing. Now they had the technology. They could have done it more quickly. I think clearly electro-optical imaging was the way to go, but Nixon had said, well, I want it by 1974. Well, the only way you could do it was to go with this system. And for your information, that system worked because a modified SAMOS payload was put on board Lunar Orbiter, and it mapped the moon. It's an analog system, and you can still look it up. Nobody knows this. It carried both a close-up and a search-type lenses. And I was talking to a chap at RAND, and they couldn't read them anymore because they didn't have the equipment to look at those old tapes. You see they're all barred, you know, like a wire photo almost. So they had to go to the Smithsonian or somewhere and get equipment to work with it. But that's the SAMOS payload. So if people say, well, it never worked. Well, it did work. But it was just ahead of its time. And by the time we wanted to look at these things, electro-optical imaging became the way to go. And as I say, I think it was the right choice. Okay? I just interviewed Henry Naki, who was the DDCI for George Bush, who was DCI then, not president. And he was there at the transition. And there's kind of a myth about that George Bush had declared it operational and given it to the new president, Jimmy Carter. Well, turns out that that's not the case. Mr. Bush had already departed, and he'd left it to Naki and some others to do the transition. And they went down to Plains, Georgia, presented the photos. Carter was entranced with this. And he had them all come into a National Security Council meeting shortly thereafter, after he'd assumed office. This was in the transition period. And Naki remarked, he said, I remember his telling everybody to pay attention that this was the instrument that would allow us to go from arms control to arms reduction. And that's just an interesting, again, sidebar on that. But you hear different stories, and it's always a question of whether they're apocryphal or not, although in this case, Naki was present, and I don't doubt the authenticity of it. Yes, in the back.
Could you comment on the manned orbiting laboratory?
Certainly. This is a system that never flew. It was called Dorian, KH-10. It had a fantastic camera, and the Air Force was interested in manned spaceflight. So this really generated outside Project A and came from the Air Force proper, but once approved and everything, and people started saying, well, what are we going to do with this laboratory in space? And we got to have a military mission for it. And reconnaissance was an obvious choice. So Program A became involved. The MOL was authorized in '64 with a first flight like in '68, or '69, '68. In 1969, it had now about tripled in price. John McLucas, a former DNRO, told me it was consuming about 25% of the Air Force research R&D budget, and it was still just as far away from a first flight. Now, the reason it was approved for reconnaissance at that time in '64, '65 was because its lifespan in orbit was to be a full month, 30 days. Now, the film recovery systems in that time were only a few days. They operated for maybe 6, 7 days max. By the time we canceled the MOL program, President Nixon, there was a pinch between the hexagon. It was consuming, this is the counter-rotating optical bar, and for funds, and MOL, plus the fact that the gambits and the follow-on programs were operating for a month at a time and more. So the justification for it had also kind of evaporated. There's wonderful stories about it. The first astronaut selected went out to the West Coast to talk to John Martin, who was the Program A director. And the story goes that they were very excited about this opportunity to be in space and to really wield these things. And they asked him, what do we do when the cameras go on? He said, hold your breath and don't move. Because again, for every reaction, there's a reaction in space. And that was another problem, stabilizing that platform with people moving around. So for a variety of reasons, it was canceled. And I might add that it spared the Air Force the agony that NASA has gone through. Because NASA, with Project Apollo, which really triggered Air Force interest, gee, where all the drama and is manned spaceflight. Apollo caused NASA to divide its operations between manned and unmanned flight. Well, guess who gets the lion's share of the budget? Space science, applications, and everything else is, as they say in Alabama, sucking hind tit. And it's been tough for them ever since. And if you look at what's going on with the space station today, it just is eating everything up. And like MOL, it's years late and many dollars over budget. Okay, any other questions? If not, one more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a nice weekend, and thank you, Mr. Hall.